Okay, so let's get started. We may have more people filter in, but the clock is ticking. So for those that were not here this morning, welcome to the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. Today is the official launch of Bridges, a new kind of supercomputer. And we basically scheduled this for once the system would be complete. So as many know, it has been running. Phase 1 was running as of July, early users in February. Since then, we brought the rest of the Phase 2 hardware in October, got people on that in November, and so people are doing lots of good work. I'm going to tell you today about what the system is, some about what's being used for. I'd note too that this session in the afternoon, like the morning, is being webcast on YouTube Live. It's being captured. So if you have others who would like to see it but they cannot be here today, the PSC website has a link to it. And I don't know how many people are watching online, but I know in the Exceed space it's a lot. So it's actually a very good audience for the speakers who are following me. And so first of all, why are we doing this? What we've seen over the past years, and I think most people here probably know this, is that there's been a shift to really looking at big data. PSC, in my mind, has always done big data. We just didn't call it that. So we've done very large-scale observational data with telescopes, genome sequencers, other things. We've done very large-scale simulation data that's down here behind the plant. But even though they're very large, they pushed the storage systems in I/O bandwidth of the time. They were conceptually easier because the data was structured and in very known, well-defined formats. Where the world has changed is people getting interested in doing reasoning about everything up here on the right. Internet data, video surveillance, unstructured text from all the books that are in all the Library of Congress and everywhere else, many of which are aging, rare, and not generally available. Various specimen collections where we can imagine all sorts of imaging modes, different wavelengths, different chemical sensors, and so on. Legacy documents, obviously, and then sensor data is a tremendous source of data. And this one is from hooded seals swimming around the ocean with sensors on them, and they go places that we usually don't. So they're a great way to collect data. And it can be a huge source of input. The problem is, how do you get knowledge of it? How do you get value? And so we designed a system called Bridges. And this is a photo of the front row of cabinets, and I don't think they're even all here. And then there are 2 more rows of cabinets behind it. So it really is a large system. It's at our facility that's 13 miles east of here, so we can't offer you a tour today, but we do those. And Bridges is for 3 real things. It is for bringing high-performance computing to communities that have never used it before. It's for bringing together HPC with big data and artificial intelligence. And it's for creating new ways for people on campuses to easily and transparently move data from their campus infrastructure to Bridges and vice versa. Bridges is made possible by an award from the National Science Foundation. It's a $17.2 million award that is for the acquisition. That's about 9.65, and all of the operations and the care and feeding of the system for its operational lifetime, which is nominally through approximately November of 2019. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise is our primary integrator and partner for Bridges. I'd like to thank Mark Woodbury, who's here now, for contributing to this project. It's been a great partnership. Before I go through all the slides, people always had this question when I put this at the end: how did I get on to Bridges? So I now put this at the beginning. So for open research, Bridges is free, no charge. Our collective tax dollars have provided the resource. Access is available through peer review through Exceed. It's a national organization that provides services across centers, including Pittsburgh, San Diego, Illinois, Indiana, and Texas. There's a website there that people can apply. For people wanting to get started, there's called a startup allocation. It requires very little. It requires an abstract of what you want to do. We can turn those around in a day. We aim to get your accounts going the next day. And it gets people a very substantial start. A large number of CPU hours, a large amount of memory to begin. One can also request in that allocation what's called extended collaborative support, which for people who want help getting started, maybe for scaling up their problem from a laptop to bridges, it gets them an expert at PSC or elsewhere to help them get started. Again, available at no charge. For other users, our cooperative agreement says we have to make at least 90% of the cycles available to exceed, which we do. That leaves a little bit of discretion, and that's for helping people advance in data-intensive science, for helping industry get started. That's one of PSC's missions, and so we can do that too. And there's a lot of interest in applying AI to big data, for instance, by companies that would like to get started in this. In many cases, these are pure research collaborations, and that's mutually interesting. So there's a lot of hardware out there. I wouldn't even try to work through all the offerings from HPE or others of what all they can sell us if we want to buy it. But we always start at the other side. We start with what problems are people trying to solve, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to enable science. And so these are some of the use cases we were considering when we were figuring out what architecture could we build to deliver new capability to the national community. And so just going through a few of these, not all of them. Data-intensive applications and workflows, this is key. People increasingly are working with large data sets. We are hearing from faculty in departments in social sciences and other schools that they need a big data component to their research if they want tenure. And people are recognizing there's a lot of value in data. And then stitching that all together into a workflow where you can maintain provenance, where you can know what has been done and reproduce it, is critical. Gateways are web interfaces to let people use domain-specific applications, data sets, and frameworks without having to become computing experts. Shared data collections is something that's really emerging on bridges. The thought that you can have a large data set, and that essentially forms an instrument around which a community can begin doing research. This may be a text corpus. It may be an fMRI data set from a brain. It may be a genome atlas. And it can be the raw material for a large number of researchers to make progress with. In addition, it can let people collaborate across disciplines, especially when you imagine what you can do by bringing together different kinds of data, say GIS data, climate, weather, population. You can use this to advance study of pandemics, social networks, all kinds of things, by having them together under the same roof. And there are many more of these. I want to jump down to these two. One of these is deep learning, for which GPUs are the tool of choice today. And the second is graph analytics and machine learning of other kinds. And for these, the key is very large RAM, or very large memory within a node. And so we have all these different use cases, and they all have different requirements. Some want I/O bandwidth, some want very large RAM, some want GPUs to accelerate them. And what that meant is we had to build a system unlike what I'm going to call traditional supercomputers, where you essentially have one kind of server, one kind of node, and you may have 1,000 or 10,000 copies of it, but it's very homogeneous. Here we had to build something that's extremely heterogeneous, and where computing and data are intimately coupled. So our approach is really this. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so as a true solutions architect, Mark closed the door. So our approach is really threefold. It's first of all to unify the compute and the storage. So rather than having a giant computer here, and a giant storage system here, connected by a drinking straw, we put them together. The second is embrace heterogeneity. And this was one we knew what we had to solve. I had the great privilege of writing a proposal of imagining and saying, this is what we need to build. And then knowing that I could turn to PSC's systems group run by J. Ray Scott, who is not here at the moment, but was here in the morning, and Jason, who's in the back, and tell them, okay, this is what we've imagined. This is what the users want. This is what has been awarded. Now please make it happen somehow. And so they've broken a lot of ground to do this. They've been the first. We'll talk a little bit about file systems. They've been the first to employ OpenStack, which is a framework from the cloud world, to provision HPC resources at this scale, using a system called Ironic for performance. And so they've broken a lot of ground, and a lot of people are following suit. And then the third is, again, behind the plant, to give people a really uniquely flexible software and user environment, where we're giving them, under one roof, interactivity. Interactivity is something you don't get in supercomputing normally. Being able to do something at immediate response. Gateways that we talked about, databases. Databases are always running. Distributed web services. High productivity programming languages, things like R, MATLAB, Python, that people are using, that students are using. And then other things like Hadoop and Spark. And putting this all under one roof. So you have different pieces expressed in different ways that all work together. And so the first feature I just want to mention and drill down a little bit into is interactivity. We were looking when we were doing the requirements of what people needed. And based on earlier user surveys within Exceed, this is what had been named as number one thing. You know, people were conditioned. J. Ray, you just missed my acknowledging you.
Lack of sufficient food.
Yeah, and so the thing is, people are conditioned now by these and by web searches. They expect to do something and they expect something to happen. They do not expect to submit a job and come back in a few days and see that maybe it worked, maybe they had a typo. And so by provisioning bridges carefully, again, relying on the gentleman in the back row, and always having some set of resources appropriately sized so that people have a reasonable expectation of having things happen on demand and yet not wasting resources, we're providing a capability. A lot of this relies on giving them smaller scale, not a whole node, maybe a core, maybe a few cores. And it's working out very well. The second one is gateways. These are the tools I mentioned for providing a web interface to some domain. The ones I'm showing here are, this is the Galaxy Gateway. Galaxy is a framework for arbitrary applications. It's most widely used for bioinformatics. Galaxy has about 80,000 users. The main instance of the Galaxy portal is hosted in Texas. It now has a back end where large memory jobs can be transparently sent to bridges to run on its large memory nodes. This means that all of these users, who are mainly bioinformaticians and biologists, can use bridges without having to worry about how do I log in, how do I transfer files. They can just use the web framework they're already using and now access all this power. The second one is called the Causal Web. And I'm not going to go into much detail because we have two experts in this to speak about it in 20 minutes. But it allows people to look for cause and effect relationships in big data. And the third is Gene Pattern, which is another genomics framework produced by the Broad Institute, a collaboration between Harvard and MIT, for, again, going out to tens of thousands of users. These are democratizing. They provide HPC as a service. They spare users the pain of writing individual allocations, because in most cases, the allocation is proposed and awarded to the person who stands up the gateway. And they extensively use all the different pieces of bridges. A second part that's important here is virtualization and containers. I think this is a really hot topic now. A lot of people are wanting containers for doing various things with software reproducibility and for portability. This is to some extent work in progress. We are running one of our own Galaxy instances in Docker for broad use. There are things that are very important, like security. And so we're starting to get involved with Singularity to move toward making that happen. And I mentioned before that Bridges is using OpenStack to provision resources. And on top of that, we're using Slurm to schedule them. And then doing other things to make it transparent to users. These high productivity programming languages are exceedingly important. They're what people do. One of our founders, Michael Levine, who is here this morning, teaches a course in computational physics at Carnegie Mellon. This year, of all the students in that course, the only language that all of them knew coming in was Python. And that's important because if we want to engage modern undergraduates and graduate students, we have to provide the tools that they're accustomed to. They've embraced Python. R is very important in the social sciences and some other fields. A lot of people in engineering are using MATLAB. We also have a very heavy demand for Jupyter notebooks. We're in the process of setting up Jupyter Hub on Bridges to support that. We have very important uses of Java. We'll hear about one of those again in a few minutes. It has a mind of its own. Another piece of this is the whole Hadoop and Spark ecosystem. From the non-academic world, we know this is really important to the enterprise. It was started by cloud scale computing. It has tremendous impact there. We have some people using this for research and for developing even better approaches. So for example, there's a project called Petrium down here that's kind of like Spark, but a lot more efficient for machine learning. And so these are important. We teach courses in big data. John Urbanik in the back row leads PSC's training, teaches these workshops nationally. For anyone in the room or out on watching the YouTube feed, we do these, all of them are distributed. We do them 18 sites each. One site's PSC, the other 17 are somewhere. They've been in the country, they've been as far as the Middle East. We do these live, bidirectional, high definition to ensure a real classroom experience. They're interactive, people can ask a question. There's extensive hands-on, so people leave knowing that they can run with the skills they've learned during the workshop. The big data workshops are the most popular of those we teach. We've had typically over 300 people at each one now in recent incarnations. So first of all, now that we've established what all we want to do with Bridges, what does the system look like? The conceptual architecture is this slide. So conceptually, it's easy. There's the Intel Omnipath architecture fabric in the middle. This is the new interconnect from Intel. We believe it's the best possible price performance for this system, or systems like it in my opinion. That connects now everything. First of all, it connects the main compute nodes on the bottom. And we'll go into more detail what these are. There are three kinds, three sizes of memory. It connects the parallel file system. Again, equal citizens on the same fabric. It connects to management nodes that let us run the system, and then things like web servers, databases, data transfers for bulk transfers to and from instruments and other sites, and logins. Those nodes then go out to Exceed, users, other campuses, instruments, and the rest of the world. So that was the cartoon view. It's easy. The real view is this one. This is actually a live app on the PSC website if you go to Bridges Virtual Tour. And it lets you rotate it, click around, click on every element, see what it is, see what the hardware is, understand what it's used for, and also see how different parts of the system are recruited for different kinds of applications. And maybe I'll get brave and bring it up. But essentially, this is it. I'm going to try very quickly to do that experiment. So this isn't the perfect. Okay, well, let's not do it that way. I don't usually go in that way. I'll just make one real quick try because, well, if I can get this window out of the way, I will just go to the local copy, which is and the only thing I don't know here. So Steve, is this on the screen share? Good, that's my only concern. Okay, so the real point of Bridges Virtual Tour is that here's the full system. If you go into this, you can see, first of all, everything in the middle here is the Omnipath architecture fabric. We have the switches, which are these spheres, and we have also these. They're the same, they're only different colors for clarity. And we have the wires. Some wires are copper, some are optical, depending on length. At the bottom of the diagram, we have 800 nodes that have 128 gigabytes each of RAM. Those we call regular memory. They're for capacity, they're for cloud-like applications, they're for scaling out, they're for traditional HPC, so things written in MPI plus something. Also down at that level, we have a number of nodes here in green. The green for NVIDIA Green have GPUs. So we have 48 nodes with 2 GPUs each. Let's say 2 GPU cards. We have 16 that we introduced early in 2016 to have 2 K80 GPUs each. And then we have another 32 nodes with 2 P100 GPUs each that we introduced in October. And these are really the latest, greatest GPUs. I'd say this is a premier system of choice for the national community in deep learning. And people are also heavily using it for other GPU applications in materials science, biology, chemistry, and other fields. Things like MATLAB can leverage it transparently too. Up here, we have 42 of these purple boxes. Those are the 3 terabyte large memory nodes. And that's 3 terabytes of RAM. We have 4 of the nodes with 12 terabytes of RAM. Together, if you actually read this, which you can't from your seats, but if you go in and click on it, you can. So these are the key for large scale genome sequence assemblies, graph analytics, and a lot of data science. There are also nodes up here for doing databases, web servers, and all these utility functions. So there's a lot there. That's our presentation at the moment. Okay, these slides we're making available too, of course. The next chart is just what's in all the nodes, because everyone always asks, what is that node? And so this is available to you. You can see every processor, what exactly is going on. The point is, first of all, it's very powerful. Second, it's very heterogeneous. The 12 terabyte nodes at the top, 3 terabytes. The 128 gigabyte nodes with and without GPUs. All the database nodes and other types going on down. The system capacities, since this is a more technical symposium, are about 1.35 petaflops per second of floating point execution, and that's 64-bit. So it's not the fastest machine in the world by floating point performance, but for this sort of coupling of data-intensive HPC, it's one of the most powerful. There's 274 terabytes of aggregate RAM, and again, that ranges from 128 gigabytes per node up to 12 terabytes. There is a local disk in each node. That is for portability, it's increased performance. Aggregate local disk is about 7 petabytes, or assuming your laptop drive is a terabyte, 7,000 of those. The parallel file system, I'll say more about in a moment, is 10 petabytes of usable space aggregate. Bridges is the first incarnation of the Intel Omnipath architecture fabric. For those not familiar with it, you know about Ethernet as a networking protocol. There's a step up from that called InfiniBand, and Omnipath has been introduced even more recently. It's 100 gigabit signaling, so 12.5 gigabytes per second per direction along each wire, and sub-microsecond latency, and very high message injection bandwidth of 160 million messages per second. So we feel that it is the highest performing for the price network. One of the keys to that is these switches that we're using are 48 ports, which lets us build that topology that was in this slide here. Each of these switches has 48 wires coming out of it. Lets us build the network with fewer switches. That reduces cost and increases performance. And so that's been going really well. We got this hardware in January as the first site, and we've been very happy with it. The topology is something we developed at PSC for doing this very unique workload. We then worked with Intel to validate it, verify it to be routable, and it was the collaboration with Intel that led to the second orange wire between each of these nodes. And that's for resilience and improved congestion control. So in terms of parallel file systems, I said we have 10 petabytes of aggregate usable space. That's divided into two. Right now it's no longer pylon 1 and 2 per se moving forward, but they're two file systems. One of them is running Intel Enterprise Lustre. That has the advantage of running natively over Omnipath, so it gives us really good performance. And the Intel Enterprise Edition gives us the newest features and was the way to go. The second is /2. /2 is a file system that J-Ray's team has developed over the years. Initially funded by the National Archives, and then through our Data XSL project, it lets us federate underlying file systems and provides some very nice wide area network capabilities, which we've been using in production for years with Pitt Department of Biomedical Informatics for sharing data from the Pitt cluster and PSC's HPC machines. Basically lets people have data in a single namespace, automatically and transparently do the data migration, and work on it as if it's local. And once they touch it, it becomes local. So we're using both right now. We also have storage on each node, as I've mentioned. We have nodes for doing databases, and these are persistent, where they don't go on and off with queued jobs. And I have to apologize, I'm going to take a few minutes over because we started 10 minutes late. We also have in the system, okay, we are good. We also have express GPU nodes. So as I said, we have two kinds of GPUs. We have the K80s, and these are Kepler architecture nodes. And then we introduced another 32 nodes, so 64 P100 GPUs. And these are the brand new Pascal architecture, exceedingly fast. And what you see really is they also go down to 16-bit precision. And that's really interesting for a lot of deep learning frameworks where you can do a lot of the math in 16-bit and then just go back to 32-bit for the accumulation, effectively doubling your speed yet again. And so these are being very heavily used now for TensorFlow, Caffe, Theano, and Torch. And so I want to transition now to a few applications, what people are doing with the machine. I mentioned this one this morning, but since I think there are probably some different people this afternoon, this is a case of metagenomics. So this is looking at not just a genome. Our genome has 3 billion base pairs. These researchers, led by Ping Ma at the University of Georgia, were looking at the metagenome of the human gut in diabetic patients versus patients without diabetes to understand what organisms are different. This is 378 billion base pairs, again, over 120 times the size of the human genome. Makes a very hard problem. And what they found was about 2,500 different species level clusters. This correlated well with their understanding and experimental observation of certain bacterial species that are present or not present in diabetic patients. And this kind of analysis can lead us to understand better how our microbiome affects the disease, is affected by it, and in turn, how we might remediate it. Another example I showed this morning briefly is extending this. So this was 378 billion base pairs That's really hard. This one is looking at 11 genomes, or 11 metagenomes in oil sands tailing ponds. So how do we bioremediate things like these oil sands? And here we have and oil spills, 1.6 trillion base pairs. And so these are truly groundbreaking first ever calculations. In this case, these are using regular memory nodes. A lot of sequence assembly, especially for large plant genomes, those run on our shared memory nodes. We have many examples of those also. One example of this is from Chris Mason at Cornell, who looked at all of the data in the NCBI reference sequence database to assemble all of the k-mers, or these small units of information. And to do that, he had custom code. They had very large in-memory hash table, because this is, again, very complicated. It's a big graph problem that can't be distributed efficiently. And he ran on one of our nodes for 24 days using 12 terabytes of RAM. And that never would have happened without these nodes. It would not have fit in any other kind of system. And it just wouldn't have been done. It hadn't been done yet. The Causal Web leads into the talk that is next by Greg Cooper and Clark Leemore. And I just want to give you the background on how it uses bridges. We talked about these different types of nodes. I meant to overlay that diagram on this one. But the key here is being able to give users a web-based portal, which Greg's team has developed using just standard HTML, CSS, JavaScript to run in a web browser. It lets people prepare and upload their data. That communicates with, they have dedicated Apache and database instances on bridges running in virtual machines. Those all go to these blue Omnipath links. The red link is commodity internet. They talk to their database instance, it's MySQL currently, to do authentication of users, data management, provenance. That then runs on the large nodes in this picture, could be regular too, depending on what you're running, and talks to the data that's in the Mellon file system. They've actually added their own file system because they need very sustained access to very large data. So that'll be happening too. And the fMRI data set, an example of that is what Clark will speak about in a few minutes. And so this ties together different kinds of nodes on bridges. And because people may be connecting to it at any time, from anywhere, this has to be always available, which is why these have to be in VMs that are always running. Unlike a normal supercomputer where you have a batch job that runs and then finishes and is gone. So being able to serve that sort of persistence and enable these algorithms that have not previously used supercomputers. I should note another difference here is that this code builds on a program called Tetrad that Clark's group developed over a very long time, and it's in Java. And there's no reason to move it out of Java. It works. And so being able to run that as is and develop tools based on it is a win. A project in my own group is applying deep learning to Connectomics. This leverages a project we have with Harvard for going from scanning electron microscope images of thin slices of the brain, assembling them into the map of neurons in the cortex, understand how brains are wired. The challenge here is that these are the images, and these are small. I mean, the real images are very high resolution, they're big. This is just a tiny slice. In the past, people have sat in front of a high-res screen and labeled neuron, every time the human experts see a neuron in this image. And obviously, that takes training too. The data sizes are becoming prodigious. A full mouse brain would take about 1.4 exabytes at current imaging technology. And so the objective here is to apply deep learning to automate this process of going from these images to where the neurons are, and then build that network and get the humans doing more creative, useful tasks than labeling neurons in a grayscale image. That work involves 3 undergraduate interns in my group. It's going really well, and we will be presenting it at this year's NVIDIA conference in May. There are many other projects and bridges using deep learning. I'm not going to go through them here, but they'll be in the presentation. One more example I want to give It's being applied in engineering. Of course, just because we're reaching out to non-traditional users doesn't mean that the traditional applications like engineering and CFD don't also run extremely well. They do. An example of that is this one by Anirban Jana and collaborators Mark Kimber at Texas using OpenFOAM. Again, running extremely well using bridges. It's a supercomputer, therefore it runs molecular dynamics really well too. In this case, this is from M at Lehigh, and they're using the P100 nodes and getting fantastic turnaround for very large, complex nanodisk simulations. And so this is an example of using the GPUs for something other than deep learning. The last example I really want to give is just of a nice symbiosis. Another unique system we have at PSC is called Anton 2. And this is a computer here from David E. Shaw Research, or DESRES, where they have built a purpose-designed system of both hardware and software to do one problem, and that's solving long timescale molecular dynamics on the order of 2 orders of magnitude more efficiently than you could do on a general purpose computer. And so that's great. But Anton 2 needs pre-equilibrated trajectories. So you need to prepare your data first. And so Bridges is providing that. This system is allocated through the national academies, giving people the only access in the world for open research to that technology. And they're doing their preparation of their data sets on Bridges. So it's a great way of them feeding off each other. I already spoke about galaxies. I'll skip that. Just a few words. This is something from Carnegie Mellon, from Chris Warren. It's a website called 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon. It's very large-scale text analytics, looking at this biography dictionary with about 59,000 entries, 60,000 words, looking at essentially the social network in early Britain. It's fascinating because it's natural language processing and machine learning. This is early Britain because that's Chris's specialty. It's equally applicable to modern society. It could be applied to newspapers. It could be applied to any text to understand social relationships and networks. And I think it's just a great way of new applications for which people need this kind of scale. It's also enabling collaboration and a great deal of bringing people up to speed in data science. Last example of that is from Do-Kyun Lee at CMU, who's looking at e-commerce. And this is another nice application of different things. So he's using deep learning, little networks down here, unreadable, but it's a deep network with neural layers, to first classify photos on Airbnb as, let's say, normal photos versus professional quality photos. And then using difference in difference analysis expressed in R using large memory to make statistical inferences about how much photo quality influences sales per annum, and overall property values of other properties in the neighborhood, and getting very interesting results. Do-Kyun is from CMU's Tepper School of Business. Again, not people who've used us before. He's teaching courses in this. They've had coursework allocations to enable other students to do this kind of thing. It's led to many publications already. And so that's where I'd leave it. I'm not too far over. I've made up a little bit of time. And I'd be happy to take, say, 2 or 3 questions. For people who are online, you can ask questions by chat, and we have someone reading them. We'll answer what we can. For those in chat that we can't answer here, we'll capture the session and answer them remotely. So thank you for your time. Any questions? Wow. Anything from out there, Robin? Okay. Yes, I do have one set from Mona, who we know well, and we'll address those offline. They're basically asking about containers, and so Docker has issues that it's hard to make widely available easily. We envisage maybe making certain containers available. Singularity we're working on. We'd be happy to talk offline about where that stands and to work with you, Mona, assuming you're watching, on particular use cases. We do want guinea pigs. And Yes, absolutely. Containers can be set up for weeks or months as gateways. That's what we're doing for one of our Galaxy instances now. Yes, Clark.
You mentioned a very large grant from the National Science Foundation. What institutions support maintenance and continuation of bridges?
Well, the question was, what institutions support maintenance and continuation of bridges? Maintenance is part of the 17.2 million. The acquisition was 9.65. The rest, which is capped at 20% of the acquisition per annum, is the O&M. Continuation, we have to compete. We have to go back to the drawing board, think again, and figure out what to do next. We're certainly thinking about it.
How long does the National Science Foundation support under the present contract endure?
Nominally through November of 2019.
Good, I'll be retired before then.
That's how we planned it. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. I would like to turn it over. The next speakers, it's a tag team presentation by Greg Cooper, who is the PI for the NIH Big Data Knowledge Center for Causal Discovery, and with whom I've had the pleasure of working on several projects. We also have a project together funded by Pennsylvania called Big Data for Better Health, focusing on lung and breast cancers. And the second presenter is Clark Lemore, who is from Carnegie Mellon's Department of Philosophy. Again, a group that is new to us, and we're very happy. It's been a pleasure working with both of your groups. So I will transfer to your slides and turn it over to you. I left them in two decks because there are different aspect ratios.
Okay.
This is on. You expect me to remember what I just did. Better, Steve?
Okay. Thanks, Nick. It was a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon. So I'm going to, this is Clark and I actually are sort of a tag team presentation. I'm going to give more of a general view of the Center for Causal Discovery and some of the basic concepts around it. I wanted to mention that we are a collaboration of the University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University. The Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center is certainly a tight partner in this. And then we have some biological and clinical investigators at Yale University that are working on some of the projects within, demonstration projects within the center. And I am the, as Nick mentioned, I'm the PI along with Yvette Bahar, and I serve as the director of the center. So I just wanted to talk about these points. First, just give you a general overview of causal discovery in biomedicine to lay a context, and talk about some basic components of graphical causal discovery. We don't have time today to go into a lot of technical detail, but I would like to sort of motivate some of what's under the hood of what we're doing, and I hope that'll help set things up for when Clark talks about an application of some of these methods. And then give a brief overview just of the center itself and how it's structured and what our particular aims are. So, as we all know, science is centrally concerned with the discovery of causal relationships in nature. We want to understand nature. We also, as a practical matter, would like to predict and particularly control systems. In healthcare, we'd like to be able to maintain health as well as cure disease. So control is very important, and control is a causal issue. Examples are determining genes and cell signaling pathways that cause breast cancer. Another example of causal discovery would be discovering the clinical effects of a new drug, or uncovering mechanisms of pathogenicity of a recently mutated virus that's spreading rapidly in the population. So why did we establish this center now? Two main reasons. One, algorithmic advances that have been made in the recent couple of decades. And the other is, as we all know, the availability increasingly of big biomedical data to be analyzed. So in the past 25 or 30 years, there's been a tremendous amount of progress, and Clark's group has driven a lot of this in the development of computational methods for representing and discovering graphical causal networks from a combination of data and background knowledge. And these methods are generally applicable to biomedical data. The other is the availability of big biomedical data. As I said, the variety, the richness, the quantity of that kind of data has been increasing rapidly, as we know. We got high throughput molecular data, such as whole genome sequencing data, clinical EMR data, much more pervasive in the United States and internationally, and makes that data available for analysis, and population health data from resources such as social media and mobile sensors. So the appropriate analysis of these types of data has great potential to advance biomedical science. And what we're doing is basically combining these two entities, data, these algorithms, to produce, on the right you see, causal networks. The basic workflow that we envision this kind of analysis fitting is illustrated diagrammatically here, where we have prior knowledge, and in biomedicine there's much that we already know from the literature and other sources. We also have data. We'd like to analyze those, and in our case we're producing causal networks, and I'll go into more detail about that in a moment. The data that we have can be both observational and experimental, and the observational is particularly interesting because there's a lot of it, and we'd like to squeeze as much causal knowledge as we can out of that observational data. We in general can't obtain everything we want to know causally from observational data, but on the other hand we can obtain some things, and those can sometimes be very informative. So we produce these causal networks then on the right, and the main purpose of these networks from our point of view is to help biomedical scientists generate causal hypotheses. And our main goal is to suggest causal networks that suggest causal hypotheses that are novel, significant, and valid. What we're trying to do is improve the efficiency of the whole overall scientific cycle, which these hypotheses would lead to experiments by the biomedical researchers. And then the results of those experiments would lead to new data, and the cycle would continue. So we aren't doing this in order to output the absolute truth that then goes into a textbook. We're really trying to suggest hypotheses that narrow the field such that if they're acted upon in terms of experiments will lead to valid experiments that increase the knowledge in a particular biomedical field. So in terms of the basic components then of what goes on and what we're doing, there's three main components. One is a model representation that we need for causation. The other is methods for searching among those models. And then as we search among those models, we need to be able to evaluate them. So I want to talk about each of these briefly in turn. In the graphical models that we use, the typical one is a causal Bayesian network, and nodes in that network represent variables, and arcs represent direct causation, and it's a directed acyclic graph. And a variable is modeled as independent of its non-effects given its causal parents. So an example of that would be, for example, this particular causal Bayesian network of three nodes indicates that C is independent of A given B. And the notion there is that the only way that A can affect C is through B in this model, and therefore if we fix B, changing A will not affect the distribution of C. That's sort of at an intuitive level, that's what is being represented, these kinds of independence relationships in these graphical models. And in some sense, it's representing that causation can be represented in a local modular fashion. So that's a structure, and then that structure leads to a factorization of the joint probability distribution, which is shown here for these three variables. So this particular structure implies that we factor the distribution as the probability of A, the probability of B given A, and the probability of C given B. We don't have to include A as a conditioning variable here because of the independence that I mentioned before, and that gives us our probability distribution, our joint probability distribution over all the variables from which we can do many things. So here's an example that's adapted from the literature, a paper in Science by Karen Sachs and colleagues on protein signaling networks learned using these kind of techniques from multi-parameter single-cell data of human T cells. And the nodes represent phosphoproteins or phospholipids that some of which they measured, some of which they intervened upon. The arcs represent direct causation in this signaling network within these T cells. And I don't have time to go into it, but it's an interesting article, and to a large extent, the method, the causal Bayesian networks that they learn, were actually quite close to the consensus network of the biology that's been studied extensively over many years. And the reason why they studied this particular set of variables and system is because it was well understood, and they wanted to see if these kinds of techniques could actually reconstruct what is the known biology. So that's a 2005 paper in Science. Some of the key kinds of causal relationships that exist, some of which were exemplified in the previous slide, are direct causation, where measured variable X causes measured variable Y. The second one here is we have endogenous latent variable H, standing for hidden. X is, again, measured in Y and Z are, but we have this latent variable in between X and Y and X and Z. A variation on that is latent confounding, where we have, again, a hidden variable H causally influencing a measured variable X and Y. And this is oftentimes why we do experiments, is because we're concerned that the statistical relationship between two or more variables is due to this kind of latent confounding and not due to a direct causal relationship between X and Y. And the fourth one that I show here is not as often appreciated, but it is a way in which X and Y can, for example, be statistically dependent in our data. And in this case, this special variable S means that these two variables, actually their values together, influence whether or not the data samples that we have in our data set were in fact there, our samples came into our data set. So this means that X and Y, their values actually influence the sampling of the data. Therefore, X and Y can be statistically dependent, not because they have any sort of direct causation or because of latent confounding, but because of this kind of selection effect. And then, in terms of model search, the space of causal Bayesian networks is very large, typically, if you have more than a few variables, and I'll get back to this in a minute. So we usually have to do some form of heuristic search in seeking to find the most likely causal Bayesian networks. So this just illustrates, sort of in a cartoon fashion, some of what you might imagine. We have these three variables again. And what the system is doing is searching over a lot of different causal possibilities, and oftentimes it might be a greedy search that's trying to sort of find the more and more probable networks. But it's searching over millions or many millions of networks, looking for ones that are supported by the data and by background knowledge. And by supported by the data, there's two main ways in which that's currently evaluated. One are constraint-based methods, and these find equivalence classes of causal models that are consistent with the statistical dependence relationships, like a chi-square independence test, that are found in the data. So you have all of these independencies that you find in conditional independencies, and you find causal models that are consistent with those, and you generally get an equivalence class. But those equivalence classes can have invariant relationships where in all of the members of the equivalence class, X is causing Y directly, and therefore you have support that X in fact is causing Y from that data. Another major approach is a Bayesian approach, and those search for causal models that are the most likely to have generated the data. And Clark's going to be talking about using one such method in his some of the work that he and his group have done. I just wanted to briefly mention there are a number of different issues, as you might imagine, that have to do with discovery of causal models from data. Prior knowledge can be deterministic or probabilistic. We can have discrete variables, continuous or both. You can have various types of temporal dynamics with stationary distributions or non-stationary, discrete time or continuous time. The distributions can be parametric, non-parametric, linear, non-linear, additive noise, non-additive noise. We can have feedback cycles or not. Latent confounders I mentioned before, selection bias, and the data sets can be a single, or we can have multiple data sets, and sometimes we can have data sets that only overlap in the variables. So there are a lot of issues, and all these issues have not been completely solved. We have there are algorithms that exist to handle some of these and different subsets of these. And what we're doing now is making what we think are some of the best of those available, while at the same time doing research to try to extend the state of the art to handle more of these together. So what's our big data problem? Well, let me try to illustrate that with a table. So if we just have one variable, one node, there's only one causal model. If we have two nodes, and I'm going to assume for simplicity here that we don't have any latent confounding or selection bias, and we don't have any feedback. It will be worse if we had those, okay? So if we have two nodes, we have three models. A can cause B can cause A, or there can be no causal arc between them. Okay, so those are the three. If we go up to 4 nodes, we have 543 models that we need to consider. Just structure, not the parameters. If we go up to just 10 nodes, we've got over 10 to the 18th possible causal models. So you can see this space really explodes rapidly. And searching this space, when we have more than just a handful of variables, becomes very challenging, and in general cannot be done exhaustively. So our big data problem is to analyze biomedical data sets which can contain thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions of variables. So that when they contain a large number of variables, we want to be able to generate plausible hypotheses of the causal relationships that hold among those variables. An example is from the GES algorithm, which was developed by David Chickering, and also Chris Meek laid some foundational work that underlies GES. It's a popular Bayesian, causal Bayesian network learning algorithm that uses greedy search and Bayesian scoring, and we developed the fast version of GES called FGES for Fast GES, and Joe Ramsey at CMU, that works closely with Clark and others in the center, was instrumental, the chief architect of this improvement in speed. So what was done was to optimize the single processor version through a number of different techniques, including caching and various types of some basic heuristics, and the parallelized using PSC GES as well. So to evaluate it, initial evaluation generated 10 random models, 30,000 nodes, 60,000 edges on average, or 60,000 edges total. And we had continuous variables with linear relationships and Gaussian additive noise. We sampled each CBN to generate 1,000 cases. And then we provided those cases to the FGES algorithm and measured its ability to learn the data generating causal Bayesian network. And this shows some of the results. So the average arc precision was actually quite good, 99%, for being able to find the data generating arcs when you look at that. If you look at the arc recall, it was about 84%. And this was running on 128 processors at the PSC, and it took only about a little over 2 minutes. So there's more information. There's a paper called Million Variables and More that Clark and Joe and others published. Actually, there's other authors here, and that came out in December and is available online. So what are the primary goals in stepping back of the whole center? One, as you might imagine, is to develop and implement state-of-the-art methods for causal modeling and discovery of knowledge from big biomedical data. and we're trying to make some of the best of these methods available and develop new methods. Another point is to disseminate the methods and knowledge widely to biomedical researchers and data scientists. And one key part of that is software. We are implementing a suite of causal discovery algorithms and making them available in several forms that Nick alluded to. One is available as application programming interface, application interfaces. So those are we have those in Java, we have those in Python, and then we also have those in R. And these are all open source and free. And then we have the Causal Web application that Nick mentioned, which you can use a causal browser to access. Another form of software is a desktop application, which is building on top of the Tetrad system that's been developed at CMU for the last couple of decades or more. We want to make it easy to use for causal modeling discovery of biomedical scientists as a desktop interface. And all these things are open source and free. But I wanted to mention here that for this one, we are working and have a prototype where if it can run a causal analysis task on a biomedical scientist's desktop, but if the task looks too large for the system, either in terms of memory or in terms of time, it can automatically send the job over to the PSC, run it there without the scientist having to do anything other than giving permission for this, and then the results of the job come back to the desktop and is displayed in the ways that the scientists would expect them to be displayed from this desktop system. So we expect to have this working, it's in prototype now, but working in more final form in the next couple of months. And Nick and his team have been instrumental in making all of these things that I'm talking about work well and helping design them. So it's been really a great team effort and a delight to work together. We're also collaborating with other centers, and we have a training component that trains into the concepts behind graphical causal modeling and discovery, as well as about the algorithms about how to use the software itself. And I might mention that we have a summer short course that is organized by Dr. Richard Shyness at CMU, who is going to be leading this causal discovery workshop, Causal Discovery in Biomedical Data, June the 12th through the 15th, and it'll be at CMU, and this is free. So if you're interested, there should be a registration form on our website within about the next month or so. And a third goal, which I'll finish up here in just a moment, is to investigate 3 biomedical projects. And the reason for that is we want to evaluate how useful these causal discovery algorithms and methods are for real biomedical problems. And we also want those problems to drive further development of these methods. So the 3 projects that we have are, one is in discovering cell signaling networks in cancer. Another is discovering mechanisms of disease onset and progression in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And then finally, the one that Clark leads is discovering functional or causal connectivity of regions of the human brain from fMRI data. And so I will turn this over to Clark in just a moment to go in more depth to talk about some of what he and his group have done in this particular area. I just want to leave you with saying that we have online video tutorials from previous short courses last summer. We have software and documentation for that software, video lectures, literature. Registration should be coming up on our website, www.ccd.pitt.edu. And I just want to thank the 50-plus members of the center, as well as NIH, for their support for the center. We're about a little more than halfway through a 4-year grant cycle. And thank you very much.
That's more better. Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's the Hungarian comparative superlative. It's very important. Yeah, huge problem, huge problem. So I'm a philosophy professor by paycheck and for many years a methodologist by practice, which is to say my interest is in algorithms and I really don't care whether they're used here or used there. Domains are not my issue. On the other hand, one would like to have challenging applications, and even better, a challenging application that has a philosophical pedigree. So there is a philosophical pedigree to what I'm going to talk about. It goes back to Hermann Helmholtz and to Ramon Cajal and to a large group of neurologists and anatomists and neuropsychologists in the late 19th century, and you could call it the anti-soul theory. So Helmholtz's vision was that thought, thinking, cognition is a physiological mechanism more complex than, but essentially like breathing or the circulation of the blood. And the scientific challenge is to understand the parts and how they work in producing thought. So there is a philosophical view. It died in the first half of the 20th century under the impulse of behaviorism, but it was revived in the second half of the century, chiefly to the development of non-invasive means of measuring physiological processes in the brain. And of those, the most widely used, developed initially around 1990 by Ogawa and his collaborators, is what is called functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is essentially a measure of local magnetization changes in very small regions of the brain. So what functional magnetic resonance imaging produces is time series from small regions. The regions can vary according to the power of the machine and its design. So typical machines produce resolution at 2 to 3 cubic millimeters. The new multi-band machines can produce resolutions at as small as 1 cubic millimeter. And for each one of those, you get a time series. Somebody, Nick, is put in a machine, and we either tell him nothing, just don't go to sleep, and record as many voxel time series as we can, or we give him some instruction. Yes? Count from 40 backwards, or whatever it is that the psychologist may be concerned with, and record again these many time series. Well, buttons. So the goal, the Helmholtzian goal, at least in one phrase, is from time series of measurement of the entire brain at 3 millimeter or 1 millimeter cube resolution, so-called voxels, infer the causal connections between the activities of the neurons in these respective voxels. You can think of that as a sort of big goal. It's, of course, a lot more to say, to find out, for example, what are those connections doing, which of them are specific to which tasks, etc. But the first question is, can you find the connections, and at what spatial resolution can you find them? You can, of course, find them if you jumble a whole bunch of voxels together into so-called regions of interest. Then you've got a sample, you've got a variable set of 6 or 8 or 12. Yes, each one the average of a cluster of voxels. But if you look at the individual voxels, you've got between 50,000 and 100,000, more than 100,000 voxel time series. Much bigger problem. So I want to review some numbers very quickly since Greg did it. 3 is the number of directions in which two variables can be causally connected, disallowing direct feedback. So there they are. 100,000 is lower bound on the number of 1 millimeter cube voxels scanned from the brain. Now, if you do a little math in your head, you get that 5 billion is the number of pairs of variables in the above. And now, if you remember that there are 3 choices for every possible connection, you get the search space. There's the search space, 3 to the 5 billionth power. I did not convert this to base 10. That's beyond my skill level. Well, that's the search space. So I told you it was going to be a huge number. I kept my promise. So it looks like an absurd problem, right? You can't possibly do it exhaustively. No, you can't. So what information can you get out? Well, it would seem like basically none. The algorithms with which we started the Center for Causal Discovery, those algorithms were provably asymptotically correct. They're statistical estimators. They have theorems that go with them. They had implementations and algorithms that went with them, and they were just fine for 25 variables. Yes? They were just fine for little tiny systems. But now we're facing humongous systems. And fortunately, we have some friends. So I won't reprise the brief summary that Greg gave. There are a variety of statistical methods. They were developed for graphical causal models in the 1990s, principally at Carnegie Mellon. They have since, variants of them have since been developed by many people all over the world, but typically they only handle small problems. We went to work trying to make them handle big problems. And thanks largely to Joe Ramsey, but with contributions from many others, we did. So one of the algorithms I'm going to talk about is the fast, greedy equivalence search. And I want to say 2 things about it because it's relevant. You can't search that entire space exhaustively. Maybe someday your graduate students will find a way to, but we sure can't. Yes? So try to get part of the information. That means controlling your search. So there are 2 ways. One way is that you can directly penalize the complexity of the graph that you return. That is to say, how many edges it allows, specifically how many direct causes of any variable it allows. You can do that from 3 to unlimited. The other way is you can force sparsity statistically. And so you have these 2 parameters that can be used. And you can just leave them unbounded and run the thing, or you can bind it. Yes, you can put an upper bound on either one of these parameters independently. And what they do is effectively force the search either to look for the strongest connections or to restrict the number of connections. Yeah. So we ran this search on all 51,000 voxels in a resting state of a very nice guy at Stanford, Russ Poldrack, who had himself scanned every day for like half a year. He's an fMRI addict. We get oh, by the way, where were we able to do this? Yes, on the PSC. And we get this thing here, which of course is completely unintelligible. So it's one thing to show you can do it, yes? It's another thing to figure out what value it has, what structure's in there, etc. All we're doing is showing you can do it. Yep. One of the things you can do is you can cluster the voxels, as is traditional in neuropsychology, and look at what connections there are between the clusters. Well, rather than clustering and looking at the correlation of the averages of the clusters, since we have the voxel-to-voxel connections, you can ask which regions of a standard parcellation of the brain have, say, more than 100 connections. And that's what this graph is up here. By the way, these are from 2 different scans of Poldrack, months apart. And turns out Poldrack is pretty consistent over time. He, however, he's lying there and thinking of different things. Yes, burnt toast versus trouble with his kids is not making much difference. He rests pretty well. Okay, but that was the easy one. Now, a harder problem. So we have from Rutgers University these multi-band scans with over 100,000 voxels, and these people are being given a task. Do something. I don't know what the task is. But I don't care. What I care right now is, can we recover structure from 100,000 plus voxels? That's the numbers I told you before. And to do that, we need to bound the parameters. Those first scans I showed, we didn't bound the parameters. 50,000, okay, well, the penalty score, we upped a little bit, not very much. And how many parents? We didn't bound that at all, and we can run it. But you get here, not so much. And in fact, we tried it, and we couldn't get it to come back. And so at a meeting, I pled the miserable incapability of Bridges to Nick. And Nick very kindly said, I'll give it a try. So Nick ran. Couldn't do it. Bridges is just a failure. So it turns out that Joe Ramsey, who's a genius, he's my genius. I'm so glad he's my genius. Had recoded the FGS program, and Joe is he's a genius computer scientist, but he doesn't always document things so well. And so Madeline, my data analyst, and Nick got together, and I said, oh, well, we got some parameters here we need to control. And Nick controlled them, and lo and behold, Bridges works. So, so here's, hey, what am I going to do with these guys? All right. So here are, so I said you can control the maximum number of edges that can go into any node. And actually you want that to be as big as you can, because restricting that can create errors. Yes? So here it is, it varies from 3 to 15, and here are the number of edges found at various penalties. Remember, the penalty is independent. You can make the penalty as big as you want. The default is 1. Here's 12. That's as small a penalty as Nick was willing to wait for. And you can see that as you as you reduce the penalty and as you increase the max degree, you get more and more edges. And if you continued these guys up down to 12 or to 4, it would go way off the charts. You'd get lots and lots of edges. So with the smaller variable resolution, we get as many as 130,000 edges without penalization of the search. And you can, and Nick did, map the memory requirements. It turns out that bridges can remember a lot. Memory is not a problem. The execution time, well here, this is an absolutely interesting phenomenon about this kind of data analysis. Time and information are a trade-off, yes? These are, in fact, just-in-time algorithms. If you stop them, the information you get is incomplete. But up to sample size variation, it isn't false. The longer you run the thing, the more information you get, and the better the information is going to be. So it's really just a question of how much time you're willing to allot. Now, what does this work out in American? Nick?
Well, those are seconds, so.
Yeah. So, in American, what is that? In America, we work in minutes and hours. See?
Yeah, so
I mean,
the long run's a couple days.
yeah, the long run's a couple of days. All right, good. We'll take that. So that's where we are. We are working on identifying feedback cycles in these systems. After all, Helmholtz did everything. One of the things he did was to devise a whole bunch of new electrical and magnetic devices. Yep. So it seems perfectly reasonable to look for analogs of circuits in the nervous system. So we're beginning to look for them. And on and on. There are other things we're trying to do. For example, compare the networks we get from autistics with the networks we get from normals. Autistic spectrum covers a whole variety of things and conditions. We can find differences. The differences are not good diagnostics. Nobody's found good diagnostics with fMRI for autism. Certainly not as good as clinical diagnostics. So I'm sure the hospital would love to have fMRI diagnostics even if they were no better because they would be more expensive. But that aside, I'll leave my cynicism elsewhere. So one of the things you can do, you might ask, how do you know any of this is true? Well, we don't. We have two sources of evidence, maybe small. So people torture animals, yes? They torture macaques in particular, and actually determine particular regions that are affecting one another. And then you can put people in fMRI and resting state and see if the search algorithm finds those connections. The greedy equivalent search does. So that's one source of evidence. The other is we have biophysical models of the signal generating process for fMRI. You can code that, a model of that, and you can simulate resting state functional magnetic resonance time series, bold time series, as they're called. And then you can take those time series, you can give them to your search algorithm, and you can say, can it recover the structure? And yes, if we have sufficient large samples, we put together half-hour scans, 5 of them, yes, we can recover the structure with excellent precision and pretty good recall. The other thing you can do is something that Nick did. You can ask, if I change the penalty, yes, if I make things more severe or less severe, yeah, will the edges be retained? If I force sparsity, yeah, will those sparse edges be retained when I loosen up the criteria? And we found, using the lower resolution scans, that was true. They were retained at about 95%. And here I've given you some of Nick's data. This is for max degree 3. This is for max degree 15. Here's the retention rate. Here's the retention rate. And by the way, what's being varied here is the penalty from 40 to 12 and from 40 to 16. So you're keeping, there's a cluster that keeps the degree low, varies the penalty. Here's a cluster that allows the degree higher, varies the penalty. And you see, as you would expect, as the allowed degree is higher, the retention rate is higher too. But it's all pretty good. So that's the evidence that we're not just blowing smoke, though undoubtedly there's some smoke. And this work is done with the Causal group at Carnegie Mellon. I don't know, we voted on a lab name like last week. Everybody said we had to have a name. So Causal won, but I don't remember what it stands for. Anyway, Ruben Sanchez, Madeline Gleamore, Biwei Wang, Kun Zhang, Joe Ramsey, the genius I mentioned, Eric Kummerfeld, I don't know who that guy is, and our new honorary member, Nick Nystrom. Thank you very much.
So I think we have time for just one question. We're running a bit behind. I'd like to get Florian's talk in so we don't run too much over. Respect everybody. But does everyone have a question for Clark or Greg?
Yeah, I do. It sounded at first as though you're going to present the people who are then going to design experimental next tests with a suite of choices and some sort of a plausible dimension. It sounded from you, Clark, as though you got a best choice.
No, actually, I gave you one example.
Yeah.
So we gave Nick the FGES algorithm because we'd already run it on one case, but we've also run on 50,000 variable problems another algorithm, a constraint-based algorithm. We get smaller recall, but entirely consistent results. We have been working with algorithms designed to identify feedback processes, and currently what we're doing is testing them. We've run them on just a few fMRI scans, but by the time we're done, we hope to present people with a variety of options, with different precisions, estimated, limitations, time requirements.
Yes.
So they get a small batch.
Ideally, they would get half a dozen algorithms applicable for different assumptions, and they would get advice about tuning parameters and their costs.
Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, so thank you, Greg, Clark. Our last speaker today is Dr. Flory Metz from Carnegie Mellon School of Computer Science. Another region where Bridges is having a tremendous impact is on artificial intelligence and deep learning. It's certainly their strength from Carnegie Mellon, where they have a whole department of machine learning. And so I wanted to have someone here who could speak to the kinds of exciting new research that are going on. We all know about this from the press. It's useful to see actual real work rather than the hype, and this is real, so thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. Thank you everybody for coming. So yeah, I'm going to talk about some of my group's recent work on, well, recurrent neural networks for time series prediction. So I went for a very generic title because it encompasses a lot of the work that also my colleagues are doing. I know Alex Hauptmann has been a heavy user of the PSC as well, and he sent his thanks and regards. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about essentially speech recognition, but speech recognition done right. That's work that I've been doing mostly with my students Yaji Miao and Mohamed Guayed over the last 2 years. So, and this is sort of a specialization of recurrent neural networks for time series prediction, saying, well, time series, let's just use speech. So let me start with a brief introduction, pre-PSC speech recognition. This is the oldest speech recognizer pretty much that I could find. We have a dog, it sits in this wooden kennel, and I only have photographs, but people that I know have actual physical artifacts from 1922. So let me tell you, the dog shouts, if you shout Rex, the dog jumps out of the kennel. And there's a battery in the back that you can't see, but now let's say, what would happen if you shout food? Do you think the dog stays in the kennel, or do you think it jumps out? A quick show of hands, who thinks the dog jumps out when you shout food? Okay, who thinks it stays? Less people, okay? What would happen with come? Dog jumps out, dog stays in. Okay, well, what would happen for get? Let's take a look. So this is a view from the back, and you can see there's a place for a battery. And people in 1962 analyzed the system and described it that this system, it consisted of a celluloid dog with an iron base held within its house by an electric magnet. This bridge was sensitive to 500 hertz acoustic energy, interrupting the current and releasing the dog. So something about 500 hertz acoustic energy, and we release the dog. So what happens, and this is early speech recognition, if we say a word that contains energy in the 500 hertz range, the dog will be released. So if we go back to here, Rex, as it happens, contains energy in the 500 hertz range, and the vowel, the as does get, by the way. Food and come, however, do not. So, sorry. But yeah. Now what we have here is spectrograms of a woman and a man saying Rex, and I don't know if it's easy for you to see, but they're short-term spectrograms, and you can see that they do have lots of energy in the 500 hertz range. And if we look at all the vowels in English, we can see that the I sound has a lot of energy also in about 500 hertz, and sort of the location of the first formant, as we call it, which is the lowest of these black bands, at about 5, distinguishes different vowels from each other. So essentially, when people realize this, speech recognition, it's easy. It's a solved problem, and we should all go home and work on the real problems, right? But I hear that we are actually doing real things, so I'm excited about that. Thank you. So, all right, that's understood. However, there's about 7,000 languages, there's dialects, the acoustics, telephony speech, reverberant speech in rooms, there's noises, there's crosstalk, there's emotional, conversational, hyper-articulated speech. So I think you all know that we're getting there, but we're not quite there yet. And the real problems is that we know and we can show that many of our models that we're using are fundamentally wrong. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Airplanes don't fly the same way that birds fly, but there is a good fair amount of reason to do more work. And what I would argue for is that we want to simplify our models, at least for the human. So I want to replace human understanding or human analysis and sort of humans coming up with ever more complex models that have parameters that then we don't know how to tune and that we sort of have to set to some way. I want to replace those models with a more generic deep learning model where at some point everything becomes a hyperparameter, and I don't have to make many assumptions explicitly to avoid things like adaptation compensation, so that we've, as speech recognition scientists, we've been very good at using over the past, coming up with ever more complex models. So automatic speech recognition, it's really a sequence-to-sequence transaction problem. I have a sequence of short-term spectrogram vectors that I want to translate into a string of words, into a sequence of words or a sequence of phones. And the length of those two sequences varies, and they need to warp the time axes. So the classic solution for this problem have been hidden Markov models, and there's been a lot of other works on conditional random fields, but also recently connectionless temporal classification or even sequence-to-sequence translation models. And I'm going to talk about hidden Markov models, why they're bad, and talk about connectionless temporal classification, why it's good, with the advantages that it has, and why we need lots of computation on bridges to attack those problems and find nicer solutions that work better and give us new ways of adapting models or learning models that we haven't had in the past.
What do you mean by input and output sequences again?
Well, the input sequence, that's sort of just the sequence of short-term spectrograms, the spectrogram of the audio signal. And the output sequence could be words or phones, the vowels, whatever I'm trying to recognize. Okay, now the fundamental equation of automatic speech recognition, I just feel compelled to just show it up briefly. What we do is we search for the most likely word sequence, W prime, as the argument that maximizes P of word sequence W given the acoustic observation X. And we break it down using Bayes' rules into a product of the acoustic model, the probability of the observation given a candidate word sequence W, and the prior probability of this word sequence PW, which is given by the language model. Now, the problem traditionally has always been that when we build a speech recognizer, we want to minimize the word error rate because it can be evaluated automatically and typically correlates with application-specific optimality criterion. So we want to compute a reference versus our output and see how many words did we get wrong, how many words did we get right. But if you look at the previous slide exactly, you can see that we are not solving for the word error rate the way we set up our problem. We're optimizing the sentence error rate. We're optimizing the probability of getting either all the words right or all the words wrong, rather than getting sort of the biggest proportion of correct words. And that's one of the fundamental problems in speech recognition still. We are setting up the problem one way and we're evaluating for something else. And it's typically a good enough approximation, but we can do better, and the work that I'm going to talk about is part of this effort. So essentially what we do to recognize speech, I take an utterance and I take another utterance and I compare them by doing something that's called a dynamic time warping alignment. I take my two recordings of different length and I'm computing using dynamic time warping and alignment between the two, find the best match, sum up all the distances, the vector dot product between the vectors, and by doing this for a recording and sort of candidate recordings of what I want to recognize, I can do this, I can build a speech recognizer by essentially comparing my query against thousands of samples and taking the one that gives me the best match. Again, it doesn't work like that. We need to break it down. There are 60,000 words in English, 4 million two-word sentences in English. There's new words constantly appearing, so this simple approach just doesn't scale. We need to break it down into smaller atomic units, typically phones, could also be syllables, and then build models for those phones individually so that they can sort of find a compact representation of how does an A sound, how does an O sound, and then compare those representations quickly against recordings. This is exactly the job of the famous hidden Markov model, and we've done that for, well, almost 40 years, maybe 50. I'm throwing up the formal definition of hidden Markov models here. The big problem is that I need to define 5 different things: a set of states, the initial probability distribution, state transition probabilities, how likely is it to go from one state in the model to the next, and then a set of emission probability distributions that says, well, if I am in this state, what am I observing? How does the spectrogram look like? And then I need to define my feature space. And the problem with this is that 2 or maybe 2.5 of those 5 things I have to specify by hands, and I cannot train them. And even if we try and train them, and even if we show we can train them, it makes no difference whatsoever in the result. So probably this model is not a good model because it has a number of free parameters that if I train them, nothing happens. So probably I should try and get rid of it. And it's even worse. In practice, those states, I have to train context-dependent states. If I'm saying ba and fa, the sound of the A, the vowel A, depends on the previous consonant, the F or the B or the G. So I need to introduce context-dependent states. Traditionally, we needed to do this to make the model bigger. We used Gaussian mixture models, so we needed more context-dependent states because we wanted to fit more parameters. But this is where the medusas come in. It just gets ugly. We really shouldn't be doing it this way. And here's a recent slide from Li Deng, Microsoft, one of our gurus in our field also. He says, well, we used GMMs in the past, but now we can use deep learning to do this. We can use feed-forward networks, whatever we want. We can use convolutional neural networks, but essentially we are sitting a neural network on top of a hidden Markov model structure, and for a long time, the past 4 or 5 years, this has been sort of the dominant architecture in speech recognition, but already the slide says it all. I think we're just replacing Gaussian mixture models with neural networks, but we're still training the neural network on a frame basis, while really what we want to recognize is a sequence, and that doesn't fit anywhere in the model. So again, I think it's ugly, and we shouldn't do it that way. If we have a model that has explicit states in it, well, what about the duration of the states? I am in a state, and in a hidden Markov model, at least in a first-order Markov model, the probability of staying in that state decays exponentially, while this is the curve. Here, while when I take a phone and I look at actual speech, the duration of a phone is, of course, distributed something like this. I don't have any phone that has a duration of 0, and I don't have any phones that are very, very long, but the distribution that I'm trying to fit in a model looks like this. So I'm trying to fit an exponentially decaying model to an empirically observed distribution of the data like this. We shouldn't do it that way, and I'm sure you know what's coming. It's ugly. So the state of the art, it's ugly no matter if we use DNNs, CNNs, TDNNs, RNNs, LSTMs, you name it, and we've all tried them. And many of them improve speech recognition a little bit, but it doesn't really help us. What we try and do is we learn to predict frame-based posteriors for each state, learn them using an existing alignment of the data, saying this is the A, this is the O, this is the P, and then sort of shoehorn them into this hidden Markov model framework that has parameters that when we try to train them, don't improve the result. All right, so let's take a step back. We're really looking at a sequence transduction problem, and all this complexity is maybe man-made. Maybe we don't need all of this. And indeed, turns out already in 2006, Alex Graves came up with a neural network that he called connectionist temporal classification that's not defined over frames and vectors of input features, but indeed it maps a sequence of inputs to a sequence of outputs. So the big difference here is that we are no longer trying to predict what are we seeing in this frame. Does this look like an A or does this look like an O? But we're trying to map a sequence to a sequence directly without explicitly classifying frames. And the length of those sequences is not necessarily the same. And the interesting observation is, or the interesting twist here, is that instead of just predicting what we put in, we're also predicting, we're introducing a new symbol that's a blank symbol that says, well, I don't know what this is, and I don't care what this is. It's none of the output symbols that we want to predict, but sort of to eat up all those extra frames in the input that we don't really want to classify, let's assign most of them to the blank and only occasionally have one of the symbols that we're really trying to classify pop up. This is not the same as silence, but it's just something that says we don't know what it is, we don't need to know what it is, because I can read off the output sequence by looking at all the non-blank states. I'll have a graph for this in a minute, and it'll become clearer. Essentially what this connectionist temporal classification algorithm does is it computes the sum over all possible alignments using a forward-backward algorithm and backpropagates the error from the output through an alignment as part of the neural network loss function. So we're marginalizing over all possible alignments of the output sequence to the input symbols as part of a neural network loss function, and we train it all with backpropagation. That's pretty interesting, and it's crazy that it works, but it works really well, and it's been known for 10 years. I'm showing the slides, but the loss function or the formulation of the graph and the derivative. For those of you who have worked with alignments forward-backward algorithm, it really is forward-backward as part of the neural network loss function and differentiable, so it's really straightforward. But the interesting thing is that let's take a network that we haven't trained, and let's take a speech sample here from the Wall Street Journal database. The sentence is, pork belly prices fell. This is the posterior of the output of the network. This is the time axis. And for a completely uninitialized network, of course, it's pretty random. And if we know that this is where the P is, this is where the R is, this is where the R is, it doesn't look too good, but already the network distinguishes between silence and speech. But even after only 2 training iterations, so after it has seen only a few dozen hours of data, we can already see that spikes appear, peaks appear, that correspond to the phones in the transcription. So after only a very small amount of data, the network already classifies the output either as one of the symbols that I'm interested in this case here the phones, or blank. So what I'm not showing here is the activation of the blank neuron, which is 1 minus the sum of all the colored ones. But it's very, very interesting that very, very quickly the network learns to make predictions, and they're almost binary. And if I train for another 12 iterations, the location of the peaks doesn't really change much. The peaks become even spikier, it becomes even more binary, but the network has already learned a fair amount of what it needs to do. The same is done or output on testing samples. Unseen samples looks almost the same, and compared to an existing traditional frame-based system, the output is very, very sparse, and sort of the alignment is less explicit, but we are not interested in it if we want to do speech recognition. So here's the original waveform of a sentence, the sound off, and I take a traditional frame-based system. I can see, well, this is where the v is, this is where the is, but it's not clear if it's the or the, and so I have 2 different competing phones showing activations here. Then I have the S, and then I have the R here, and the sound off. And you can see that, well, there is some transition period where the sounds transition from one to the other, but for those long sounds, it's pretty, at least for the S, it's pretty accurate. It's only S and nothing else, but for the R already, which is a vowel that sort of changes a little bit over time, there is a lot of, is it this vowel, is it this other vowel? And if you look here, it sounds more like this. If you look here, it sounds more like the other. And that just makes the speech recognition problem in a traditional HMM framework pretty hard, because your model needs to integrate all over this, and you need to have state transitions in it, and it's well, expensive, and I don't think it should be that way. The CTC model, however, most of those, the outputs are very, very sharp. They're almost peaks that only last for 1 frame, And for those long sounds, we can see that it's really only a single frame that where the network outputs the S or the R, and everywhere else it outputs the background, the blank symbol, which is this peak structure here. So this has been known for almost 10 years. The problem has been in, well, one, training, putting a forward-backward algorithm into a DNN and into the loss function is not straightforward, and implementing it on a GPU is even less straightforward. We've done it, so has Google and Baidu by now. So it's this is cutting edge research and engineering. And the other problem has been the decoding. Nobody knew how to turn these things into a word sequence and a lattice, so alternatives quickly enough. But my group has figured out a way using a relatively standard weighted finite state transducer framework. So essentially what you need to do is look at those blanks carefully, because in about 15% of all cases, a phone transitions to another phone directly without going through a blank state. So you have to be careful to allow transitions from foreground phone to foreground phone directly, or foreground phone to blank to foreground phone without penalizing things. And typically in FST-based decoding setups, we need counts of the priors that say this is how frequent this phone is, and you don't get those priors easily because you don't have alignments, but it turns out you can sort of augment the label sequence easily to get those priors. And in 2015, we implemented an open source software that implements the whole training and testing pipeline, and has since been picked up by a lot of groups in the speech recognition community, because the performance of the software or the resulting recognizers are pretty much as good as the baseline systems, while they're much, much easier to build, and they have a lot less free parameters for the human to look at. So they're much easier to build for the human, but they heat up the atmosphere a little bit. So that's why we're thankful to the PSC. The other nice thing is that during decoding, so training is relatively expensive. During decoding, because the search graph is much, much smaller, we're using context-independent phones rather than context-dependent subphonetic states. During search, we typically need about only 1% to 5% of the memory of a traditional system, which makes it very attractive for mobile devices and things. So looking at the results, this is a conversational telephony speech, the famous switchboard corpus. Our systems trained on about 300 hours of data have 12.9% word error rate at this point. Traditional systems have 12.5%, however, typically using adapted features, and so we're getting essentially the same performance as traditional systems. When we have an ongoing argument with the authors of this number saying, well, what is the fair baseline between those two systems? But so I'm showing the strongest baseline, and I'm arguing, well, we are very, very close to their best number on using adapted features. In other cases, we are beating traditional baseline systems. So on the Babel corpus, which is a corpus of 27 languages, we get better performance, or the same performance also as traditional systems. Much smaller and much nicer setups. And here on these corpora, word error rates of 50% are actually state of the art. So there are still speech recognition problems where getting more words right than wrong is success. But I think the biggest advantage of our system really is that this is a baseline, this is the script that you need to execute to build a CALDI system on Wall Street Journal. You prepare the data, you build the language model, you train GMM models, you train the DNN model, you create a context-dependent search graph, you decode the test data, you adapt, you redecode, you do lattice rescoring, and then you get a word error rate of 7.1%. In our system, you prepare the data, you build the language model, you create the context-independent search graph, you train the model, and you decode the test data, and you get a word error rate of 7.3%. So all this thing here goes away. Now the sad truth is that this one-step train model takes longer than all this stuff here, but that's what we have machines for, right? So to conclude, this connectionist temporal classification idea in speech recognition allows us to drastically reduce the amount of code that we have to write, the complexity of the code, and the number of fudge factors or free parameters that we have to estimate. Now, this is extremely good for non-experts, people who want to build systems in any of the 6,999 languages that are not English, people that might not have a PhD in computer science themselves, but still they want to build a recognizer in their language, and anything that we can do to make this easier makes it easier for them and takes away things that can go wrong, parameters that they might be setting wrong. So I think this is really an exciting step. We're doing away with things like the number of states, the context decision tree, initial alignments. Almost everything becomes a hyperparameter, and while we've done a fair amount of parameter tuning and parameter sweeps over the summer as well, in the future I think people will need to do a lot less of that, and this makes this a very attractive technique that's also been picked up by the community very, very quickly. We're currently working on adding some foolproof techniques that work on any sort of speech recognition task, like data perturbation, scaling the training to even larger data sets, discriminative training. But I think I want to resist the temptation of making speech recognition complicated again by adding every hammer that I know I can get another 0.2% here and another 0.3% here. I think this is a very elegant, very simple model that achieves state-of-the-art performance. And groups like Google or IBM, they're using the same model now as well, and they've scaled it up to 125,000 hours now. We're at about, our biggest models are about 2,000 hours. Google is doing 125,000 hours that took them, I think, 6 weeks on a cluster of 1,000 cores to train. I just don't have as many hands to supervise that or really look at it, but it's exciting to see that industry and us, we're working on the same types of algorithms, and I think Google is even a notch. They just have even more resources, but they're looking at the same thing and saying, well, it's fantastic that this is something that makes things simpler and just takes the human, not supervision, but makes it easier for the human to look at the things that really matter. There is a few other end-to-end approaches out there right now. The nice thing about this CTC approach is that it assumes independence between neighboring symbols, which from a practical point of view is good because I can decouple the language model from the acoustic model. And so if I have an acoustic model that has telephony speech and an acoustic model that has reverberant speech from a room, I can combine them with the same type of language model and build recognizers by saying, well, this is where the conversation happens and this is what it's about, and I can put it together. There are other approaches that we also train, that we also work on, that combine them together into one single model and then really optimize the whole model end to end. But then they become sort of inflexible, and unless you Google and say, this is what I want to run 5 million times, and I'm not going to change it, then sort of something that allows you to decouple a few things might be more interesting. I did have a slide about the progress that Bridges allowed us to do over the summer, but I forgot to include it. So still I want to tell you about it. So we were able to speed up the training, so to work on our efficiency over the summer, and what took us, a training that took us about 3 weeks at the beginning of last summer, so before the burn-in period, I think. It's taking us 2 days now, so it's been we've been trying to not burn up trees unnecessarily, but there is a lot of work to do, and I think this will help us do a lot lot of good in the future as well. And we're also using it to recognize environmental sounds. So if we have videos, YouTube videos, and there are sounds that we want to first label and then recognize, like a passing car or dogs, we're using the same type of algorithm to also recognize sounds in videos, because it's just the right model to classify those things. So thank you very much. Yes.
This is absolutely fascinating. But I have a question, and it's really about transportability and differentiation. So just to be concrete, Greg, who's invisible now, grew up in Alabama, and I grew up in Montana, and we both went through the linguistic homogenization of academia. So if you trained on me, how good would you be at predicting for Greg?
So if I only trained on you, I would be bad at predicting Greg. If I train on all of us, if in academia, I'd probably be, so there was a famous paper by Microsoft just a couple of weeks where they said that speech recognition has achieved human parity for English, for conversational telephony speech. So a human that transcribes telephony speech from another English-speaking human has an error rate of 6.2%, and the machine now throwing in another bunch of techniques and combining 3 recognizers, and you know what, has an error rate of 6.2%. So machines are as good as humans, but that's true if you collected 2,000 hours of human data from several hundred speakers. If you don't have that, you're much worse.
We each have more than 2,000 hours of speech recognition.
But it's well, how much, right? These are transcribed at the word level. Sentences, a kid, he or she gets more than 2,000 hours, but there's no transcriptions to go with it. So there's it's extremely interesting to look at language learning with those types of algorithms as well. Yes. I think this was a little bit earlier.
Oh, go ahead, sir.
Oh, maybe a related question, but is Haitian especially hard?
No.
Because it had an error rate of like 50%?
Or in the same corpus, we have languages that have an error rate of 80%.
Oh, okay.
An error rate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there, I mean, I was thinking maybe because Haitian is a Creole language, so it's...
Haitian is a Creole language, but at least in the data that we have, the pronunciation is relatively uniform, and the recordings are relatively clean.
It's a small.
Yeah, I mean, this is a small corpus. We have 50 hours of data. On other languages, Tok Pisin, Zulu, where we have those click sounds, the morphological complexity is huge. Haitian morphology is relatively straightforward. So, yeah.
So the worst case, like the 80%, are like
Zulu, and there's another
Gosa.
language. I forgot which one it was. But, yes, please.
Do you, could you, should you? It's one thing to train against a mixed set, but to go back to this idea of sort of the effects of local dialects and things like this, you might imagine forming multiple models and recognizing at some point that it's an ex-Southerner, and then change your strategy appropriately to do that.
Mm-hmm. We're doing very there's a lot of work going on in adaptation right now, and how do we adapt neural networks, or can we condition on information like speaker gender, speaker age, speaker dialect, and have the model, have the neural network figuring out automatically what it needs to do? Yeah. Or do we set it up like a multitask training problem where we're saying, well, we're predicting the phones and the gender of the speaker, and because we know those tasks are related. So yeah, very, very exciting times. It does help. Problem is always getting good supervision, because even if I have a recording of a Southerner and a Yankee, if they're in different acoustics, say one uses the Samsung phone, the other one uses an iPhone, one holds the phone like this, the other holds the phone like this, the differences in acoustics might be, in the eyes of a speech recognizer, might be more important than the dialectal differences. So,
Well, it widens the possibilities.
right.
Right.
Are there any other questions, anything, Robin, from the chat?
Feel free to email me.
Yes, and thank you. One question I have is just purely on the technical side. Can you comment on the speed for training? How well do these scale out to multiple GPUs? And have you evaluated P100 versus K80? I'm just curious about this myself.
Right. So multi-GPU training is something that, yeah, we do have an implementation that kind of works, but I'm not really happy with it yet. The P100s are 30% faster, I think, than the K80s roundabout in our experiments. For us, it's been more challenging to. Our data undergoes a series of reshuffling and putting together in different ways. And that's sort of been a thing that we found challenging to get right, and to make this happen quickly on bridges, making sure we're getting, for different data sets that we work on, this is the data that we put on the local drives, this is the data that we get from the Pylon 2, Pylon 1 systems. So that's been sort of where we spend most of our time. I would want to work on multiple GPUs more, but it's been this is the next thing we do. It's been like that for a couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again to everyone for coming. Please follow the PSC website, look at our social media, Facebook, Twitter, for other things that we're doing. And we'll be holding related symposia periodically on different
That's
topics.
allowed. I mean,
So
easy
stay in touch.
stuff.
Thank you.
Got it. Thank you.